Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They say the most terrifying stories are the ones nobody dares to repeat. A story whispered in fragments, told only by those too drunk to keep it hidden, or passed on through a family tree that prays it never reaches the ears of strangers. Tonight, you will hear one of those stories. A story so unsettling that, if true, it explains why a certain house in the American countryside has remained locked, untouched, and rotting away for generations. It begins with a girl. Not an ordinary girl, but one born into a family that never looked beyond its own bloodline. She grew up surrounded not by neighbors, not by friends, but only by faces that looked too much like hers. Her world was small, suffocating, and shaped by traditions outsiders would call unnatural. On one winter night, cold enough to freeze the breath in your lungs, she lay down beside her own kin. That night, something happened, something that would silence her forever. When the morning came, she did not speak again, not a word, not a scream, not even a whisper. What occurred inside those four walls has been buried beneath rumors and denials, but traces remain. The family was seen less often after that night, retreating further into themselves, their home turning into a fortress of secrecy. And the girl, her silence became its own haunting testimony. They say she never spoke a single word again, carrying her horror to the grave. To the outside world, the family presented blank stares and cold hospitality. But behind closed doors, whispers turned into suspicion, and suspicion into local legend. The neighbors called them cursed, others called them devils, yet no one dared to step inside their house. Not because they feared violence, but because they feared something much worse, seeing the truth for themselves. What exactly happened on that night remains uncertain. Some believe it was an accident, others claim it was the inevitable result of a bloodline too tangled to survive. But whatever the truth was, it silenced her, and silence, in this case, speaks louder than any confession ever could. Silence has a weight to it. When it hangs in a room, it becomes heavier than words. For the girl, her silence was not the calm of a shy soul or the innocence of a child who simply refused to speak. It was different. It was as if something had been stolen from her, as if her voice had been buried alive that night, along with whatever truth she had witnessed. Her family explained it away to strangers in passing. They told people she had fallen ill, that her throat had been damaged, or that she suffered from some unnamed condition. But the neighbors knew better. They had seen her speak before, laugh, sing, even argue. And then, suddenly, nothing. Like a candle snuffed out in the middle of a storm. What made the story even darker was the way her family carried on. They didn't take her to a doctor, they didn't send her away for treatment, they didn't even seem to mourn the sudden loss of her voice. Instead, they acted as if it were normal, as if a daughter going mute overnight was something that could be ignored, buried, and folded into their strange routine. The girl was kept close, never left alone, and always watched. Some said she was being protected, others whispered she was being controlled. The few who caught glimpses of her described a hollow expression. Her eyes darted like a trapped animal's, and her lips would part as if she wanted to scream, but no sound ever came. There was a terror in her gaze that suggested she remembered every detail of that night, a terror that could not be spoken, because to speak it would be to destroy her family's facade forever. And so, silence became her prison. The house itself seemed to grow quieter, as if mirroring her. Even when the family gathered, there was little laughter, little talk, just a dull murmur of people who had forgotten what it meant to live among others. Those who visited, and very few ever dared, described an atmosphere so suffocating that they left within minutes, never to return. The girl's silence became the town's obsession. What had happened in that house? What could be so horrific that it stole her voice forever? Some said she had witnessed a death. Others swore she had been forced into something no one should ever endure. But in every version of the tale, one thing remained certain. That night was the turning point. The night she slept with her family and never spoke again. As the years passed, the silence began to rot more than just her voice. It infected the very walls of the home, seeping into every crack, every corner, until the house itself felt like a mausoleum of unspoken truths. Travelers who wandered too close claimed they could sense it before they even saw the place. The stillness, the absence of birdsong, the way the wind refused to rattle the windows. It was as though nature itself had decided to avoid the family's land. Locals began to whisper about curses. They said the blood in that family was too close, too tangled, that their children were not children at all, but shadows of what humans were meant to be. The girl's silence, they believed, was proof that the body can endure unspeakable acts, but the mind collapses under the weight of it. Still, the family carried on. They appeared occasionally in town, their faces pale, their eyes glassy, their words clipped. Always together, never apart. They spoke little, and when they did, their sentences carried a strange echo, as though they had rehearsed them before speaking. The girl, now a young woman, followed quietly behind, her lips pressed tight, her eyes downcast. She looked like a ghost, still tethered to flesh. Some townsfolk tried to pry into their lives. A curious minister once walked up to their home, Bible in hand, determined to offer prayer. He returned within the hour, white as snow, refusing to speak of what he had seen inside. "It is not a place for God," he muttered, shaking, before packing his belongings and leaving town forever. Others claimed that at night, strange sounds drifted from the house, low murmurs, almost like chanting. Sometimes laughter, distorted, eerie, not the kind of laughter that warms a room but the kind that chills your bones. A few even swore they saw candlelight flickering through the windows long after midnight. Figures moving inside, their shadows overlapping in ways that didn't make sense. But the girl remained the center of it all. Every story, every whisper, every fearful glance always circled back to her silence. People began calling her the mute witness, because if she could speak, if she had ever dared to break her vow of quiet, she might have shattered the carefully constructed lies of an entire bloodline. The silence protected them. The silence condemned her. And in that silence, the truth of the most inbred night in history was left to rot, unspoken, but never forgotten. What made the silence unbearable was not only what it concealed, but how it spread. Families who lived nearby swore that after that night the land itself seemed to change. Crops withered faster on the edge of their property, livestock strayed too close and came back weak, and travelers lost their way in the woods surrounding the house, circling in confusion as if something refused to let them leave. The place had become a wound in the earth, and the girl, silent and hollow, was at the center of it. When she grew older, she carried her silence like a shroud. She was not married off, as many expected. She bore no children, at least none that the town could prove. Yet rumors spread of infants that cried faintly from within the home, their existence never confirmed, their disappearance never explained. Every time a rumor surfaced, the girl's expression seemed to sink deeper into despair, as if she alone knew the truth, and her silence was the only shield keeping it buried. There was one incident, though, that the town remembered vividly. On a summer evening, long after the family had vanished from public life, a boy broke into their land. He wanted proof of the stories. They found him the next morning on the roadside, trembling, unable to walk straight, his hair turned grey in patches, though he was only 17. He never explained what he had seen, but he could not stop repeating a single phrase: "Too many faces. Too many faces in one room." He left town shortly after, and no one ever saw him again. The girl herself, though, lived on. Her silence turned her into an unwilling monument. She would sit for hours in a chair near the window, unmoving, staring at nothing. Neighbors passing by on rare occasions said she looked like a wax figure more than a living being. Some insisted she was already dead, and what they saw was her body being propped up week after week to give the illusion of life. But she lived, she breathed, and she remembered. Every day of her life was spent as a witness to something so horrifying that words had abandoned her, and as she aged, her silence grew contagious. The family spoke less. They visited town almost never. Soon the only sound left within those walls was the creaking of old wood and the weight of secrets too terrible to name. Time has a way of erasing details, but it cannot erase the unease that clings to a place. By the turn of the century, the family's name had nearly disappeared from records, but the stories, those remained. Children were warned not to wander near the house. Farmers avoided the land, even if it meant taking the long road to town. The silence of the girl, by then an aging woman, had become a legend in itself, the mute who held inside her the last testimony of a night so vile that the human tongue refused to speak it. Some researchers much later tried to dig into the truth. They studied the genealogy, compared birth and death records, and noted patterns no ordinary family should have. Too many stillbirths, too many children dying young, too many who lived carried with them the strange, unmistakable features of bloodlines too closely tied, crooked jaws, wide-set eyes, bodies frail and bent long before old age should have taken hold. It painted a picture darker than any myth. This was not a family cursed by superstition. This was a family collapsing under the weight of itself. And through it all, the woman remained silent. When visitors came in rare attempts to interview her, she would only look at them with hollow eyes, as if begging them to understand without words. Her lips trembled at times, as though she wanted to scream, but no sound ever escaped. The silence was her prison, but it was also her weapon, because as long as she refused to speak, the story could never be confirmed. It lived only in rumor, in whispers, in the half-truths carried through generations. Yet the most chilling part is what came after her death. When she was finally laid to rest, quietly, with no public notice, the house itself seemed to grow darker. People who passed by claimed to hear faint echoes at night, voices too low to understand, laughter that twisted into sobbing, and sometimes a woman's gasp cut short by silence. It was as though her death had not ended the story, but released it into the very air. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent, or spoken the truth no matter the cost? After her death, the house did not remain empty. For a time, relatives tried to claim it, though none stayed longer than a season. They would move in with confidence, determined to reclaim what was theirs, only to leave abruptly, their belongings abandoned, the doors left swinging in the wind. Some said they couldn't sleep, that the silence was unbearable, pressing against their ears at night until it felt like their skulls might crack. Others claimed they saw her, sitting in that same chair by the window, staring out into nothing, her mouth open as though finally ready to speak, but still utterly voiceless. The family tree withered, names disappeared from records, lines stopped abruptly, branches cut short as if history itself refused to let them continue. By the mid-1900s, there were no direct descendants left in the town, only stories. Stories of gatherings in the woods where voices chanted in broken tones, stories of infants born and buried before their first steps, stories of the woman whose silence cursed an entire bloodline, to be remembered not for wealth, not for legacy, but for shame. The house itself became a place teenagers dared each other to visit. They would walk up to the rotting porch, peer inside through broken windows, and swear they saw shapes moving in the dark. One boy, years later, admitted that when he entered, the air felt so heavy he could barely breathe. He claimed he heard whispering, not from one person, but from many, layered over each other, all repeating the same words. She never spoke again. She never spoke again. He never returned. Researchers have since tried to separate fact from fiction. Some argue the silence was psychological trauma. Others point to hereditary conditions common in isolated families. But no matter how clinical the explanation, there remains a detail that science cannot erase: the effect her silence had on those around her. Whole generations lived in fear of breaking it. Whole towns chose not to confront it. And now, Decades later, her story is still told, even when no one remembers her name. What began as one night too horrific to be spoken of, became the defining shadow of an entire family, and the silence that followed was not simply hers. It became the silence of a community that looked the other way and let the nightmare continue. Today, the house still stands. It is nothing more than a skeleton of rotted wood and collapsed beams, but its presence lingers like a scar across the land. The windows are shattered, the roof caved in, and ivy curls around its frame as though trying to strangle it into silence, but people still avoid it. Even now. Hunters who pass through the forest take longer routes. Locals warn their children never to approach. Not because they fear ghosts in the traditional sense, but because they fear inheriting the silence itself, like a sickness passed down to anyone who listens too closely. What remains of the family is lost to time. Their graves are unmarked, their names scattered across half-finished records. But the story, her story, remains. The girl who went to sleep in her family's home and woke up voiceless, the girl who never spoke again, the girl who carried inside her the secret of what happened on the most inbred night in history. And perhaps that is why the silence was so powerful. Because silence can hold more terror than words. A confession can be explained, denied, or debated. But silence leaves a hole. It leaves the imagination free to wander, to picture the worst, to believe that what happened that night was so horrific, so unnatural, so utterly beyond comprehension that it destroyed her voice forever. Some say the silence was her rebellion, that in refusing to speak, she cursed her family, ensuring that their shame would never fully die. Others insist it was her prison, a punishment she endured until the end. But whichever version is true, the result is the same. She left behind a void that swallows anyone who dares to step too close. And so the story has survived, not because of records, not because of history books, but because people felt it. They felt it in the unease of walking past that land. They felt it in the way elders refused to discuss it. They felt it in the way silence itself became the loudest part of the legend. The girl is gone. Her family is gone. But her silence remains, and it speaks louder now than it ever did then. Thank you for watching. If you want more stories like this, haunting truths buried in the shadows of history, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who dares to listen, because some stories were never meant to be forgotten, no matter how much silence tries to bury them.